Hi everyone, Mr. P here with lesson 11 on the Freedom Rides of 1961, where we'll evaluate their success and significance. Before you finish this video, I encourage you to check out the narrative here on Global Nonviolent Action Database and the last half of episode 3 of Eyes on the Prize to fill out the chart on where you're analyzing the different elements of each of these civil rights campaigns. And this video will serve to kind of summarize and contextualize this information for you. All right. All right. So let's jump into it. So when studying this particular campaign, we always want to have an understanding of the conditions of oppression facing the campaign to change. Here with the Freedom Rides, it's a really interesting scenario where the thing that they wanted changed was already changed by the Supreme Court, and that is segregation by race on interstate travel. You can see that right here, right? There was a court ruling in 1946 called Morgan v. Virginia. This would have been, 8 years before Brown v. Board, where riders who were segregated by race on interstate travel. This was deemed unconstitutional. And it was deemed unconstitutional because of the Commerce Clause. So the Commerce Clause says the United States Congress has the power to regulate commerce with several nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. So among the several states, that means that the U.S. Congress can pass laws, okay, where they can pass laws that essentially, can regulate any kind of trade or commerce between states. Anything that goes from New York to California, Delaware to Pennsylvania, whatever the case may be. And so essentially, there was a law passed by Congress to desegregate interstate travel only. This wouldn't have affected local travel in the South, just interstate travel between the states. And so, Virginia had challenged this because Irene Morgan had refused to give up her seat on a bus traveling interstate out of Virginia, and she was arrested. And this violated the kind of federal law at the time, and the Supreme Court upheld that law and said that, interstate travel, when segregated on interstate travel, it violated the Constitution. That should be desegregated. And that, in fact, the federal government did have the power to desegregate interstate travel because that's interstate commerce. That's, bus fares, that's bus companies traveling interstate. That is interstate commerce, and therefore they can create laws regulating that. So that's the kind of context we're in. So what do we take away from that? We take away that, and I wanted to give you that constitutional knowledge, but what we take away here is that the court had already, 15 years before the Freedom Rides of 1961 said interstate travel should not be segregated. But the South did not follow that guideline. So the Freedom Rides they demanded that the federal government enforce the SCOTUS ruling in Morgan v. Virginia and the later ruling in Boynton v. Virginia in 1958 to integrate interstate transport. So they planned, this path down to, Birmingham and Anniston and all the way to, Jackson, Mississippi. And there were several Freedom Rides. There wasn't just one. There were several Freedom Rides, as you can see here. And it was the goal here was to get the federal government to enforce this order to desegregate the interstate travel in the South. And so who was leading this movement? CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Diane Nash ended up having a lot of responsibility here. We'll see later that she's actually largely responsible for the Freedom Rides not stopping once they got violently attacked, but for continuing them on. Lawyers from the NAACP offered support for folks. The method here, and this is key, they wanted to use what were known as ride-ins with interracial group of passengers. They intentionally chose an interracial group of passengers because if it was just a black bus or a white bus, then it wouldn't have violated the Southern norms. They needed it to be an interracial group, and they used that to provoke racist. They knew they were going to provoke racist extremists and gain media attention to force the executive branch, the president and his attorney general, Kennedy's, JFK, and Bobby Kennedy, they wanted to have them take action to enforce the desegregation on interstate travel. So if they provoked racist extremist action, violence against them, then it'll create a crisis, and the president, the federal government, has to act. That's the idea. And indeed, there was attacks in Birmingham. The police chief gave the KKK 15 minutes to board and assault Freedom Riders on the bus. In Anniston, they firebombed, the KKK firebombed the bus, which you're seeing here. The FBI actually knew of the Birmingham plan, and they did nothing. And there was a temptation to stop the bus. Kennedy actually, asked them to stop the Freedom Ride bus trips after these attacks. A cooling off period was asked for. And Diane Nash said, no, we will continue. So she brought SNCC people from Nashville to Birmingham. They were arrested. She brought more SNCC people. They boarded a bus and they traveled onwards to Jackson, Mississippi, where they were then arrested after they arrived in Jackson. This continuing of the rides got more attention from the Kennedys, and it led to Bobby Kennedy ordering the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal institution, to enforce the desegregation of interstate travel. Because the court had desegregated interstate travel in 1946 doesn't mean the federal government enforced it everywhere in the country. So the South still was able to kind of, maintain segregation in interstate travel. And this really demonstrated the political power of this movement. So that kind of ends with the Freedom Rides piece. In class, we're going to discuss this question at some length. This will be our class discussion on the sit-ins and Freedom Rides. And so I want you to evaluate the success in light of this question, or this quote from James Lawson Jr. He says, the sit-ins won concessions, not structural changes. The Freedom Rides run great concessions, but not real change. So if a concession is just something that, they're able to gain because the government is able to kind of like concede this small victory, and structural change would be a change in power, then to what extent do you agree with this assessment of the success? Did the sit-ins and Freedom Rides win real change, or just a concession? The sit-ins, they won desegregation at the lunch counters. The Freedom Rides got the court order to be enforced by the federal government. Is that real change? What would real change look like? If you agree with James Lawson, then what would real structural change look like? Did the sit-ins and Freedom Rides change who's in power, for example? Or did it just win concessions from who's in power? I think that's the distinction that you want to draw. When you're assessing the success of a campaign, you want to evaluate, did the campaign just get concessions from those in power, or did they change who's in power? And that is kind of what James Lawson's inviting us to think about, okay? So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that in class. All right, take care. Ciao.